What you're going to get here, if you've not used Mentimeter before, is a series of questions that I'll invite you to respond to. These are totally anonymous, so no one's going to know who said what. No one's going to have to justify or explain anything they've put, but it's a really helpful way to get a sense of where people are coming from and the sort of the consistency or diversity we've got in the event. So a few people already started answering this first question, which is how would you describe your role or roles if you've got multiple hats or multiple roles that you are here in this session with? So we can already see quite a lot of similar ideas, but also some difference. There's volunteers, there's educators, students, systems thinker, facilitator. So some of these are formalized roles, and some of these might be more perspectives that we bring. Or ideas that we come with when we think about the idea of social movements. If for whatever reason you're not able to access the Mentimeter, do feel free to put your answers to this in the chat, and that, I'll keep an eye on that as well. But I'll give it another few seconds or so to let those who haven't had a chance to join to get their answers in. But we can already see some of the words that are larger are the ones that more people have put. So this idea of facilitator, coordinator, organizer, activist, student, systems thinker, consultant, some ideas that are shared amongst the group we've got here. Brilliant, that's really useful, thank you. I'm going to move us on to the next question now, which is, which social movements are you part of? So if you're not part of any, please do put that, because that's useful to know. And I'm going to let people self-define what social movement might be. Thanks, Beth, for putting your answer in the chat. That's great. If anybody else is unable to use the Mentimeter, please feel free to do that. If you've just joined us, you can find the link to joining at the top of the screen there. So unsurprisingly, transition is quite a popular one already. Seeing as we did a lot of this is in collaboration with Transition Network, but also subject of climate as a social movement. So it doesn't have to be a kind of a formalized or branded social movement. It's quite an amorphous idea. So another few ideas around adaptation and deep adaptation: Gaia, political networks, XR, that's Extinction Rebellion, church. Trade networks, friends and family, community, organic food, justice, social enterprise, Fridays for Future, good law. So again, like with the roles, there are some formalized networks and some more informal networks. And these are all really good examples that will be great to reflect on later on in the session. Excellent, thank you for that. I'm sure we could continue, but I'll move us on to the next question. Thanks, Zizi, for sharing in the chat. Please do continue to do that. So next question is, what role do you think that social movements play in climate action? So this is quite a broad question, and again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, and again, no one's going to have to justify their answer. But again, it's really useful to start thinking about when we think about tipping points and this idea of systemic change. This is one of the ideas that we're going to explore this evening. So what is the role of social movements in climate action? So this could be a kind of big answer, it could be small. So yeah, great to see some things coming. So we can have creating pressure. Definitely, that's something I think we can talk about. And influence, a similar idea. It can increase our resilience. Allow people to take action, set examples, precedents, pushing for change, political will. Excellent, yeah, really interesting ideas. Awareness, definitely a common theme here. Education, but also this idea of shifting norms, so changing what is accepted or understood to be normal. Positive narratives, really interesting. Demonstrating alternatives, encouragements, that peer-to-peer element. Speaking truth to power, really interesting idea as well. Well, we've got building a good lifeboat. That's a really nice idea. Maybe links to that idea about resilience. Education, again, leading, inspiring others, resistance, demonstrating to politicians, mitigation via political projects, containers, direct system change as well. Psychological change, really interesting. Reaching a critical number in society, changing minds. Again, that's something that we will get back to very directly. Depends how you define movement. Yes, absolutely. And I think in this session, we're not going to define that. We're going to leave that quite open because it's about the change that we see. And this idea of positive tipping points is a very emergent one. Beth, I really like your comment in the chat. I think it might ultimately be about love. That's a beautiful idea and something it'd be really good to bring back and see how we can fit that idea into this model. Great, thank you. Again, I'm going to move us on to the next question. What do successful social movements look like? Again, there's a lot of subjectivity here. Who defines what success is? I'm certainly not going to try and do that. But when you've seen social movements that you think have succeeded or had a positive impact, what are the characteristics of those movements? What do they look like? So change, so that might be achieving change. Equity, great. Fun, yeah, really important to keep that that sense of joy and wonder. Non-violent, energized, okay, great. What else have we got? They can, so some specifically what that change might look like: informing policy, being youth-led, having a diverse membership, having visible positive impact. Absolutely. Appreciate this is a slightly harder question, but again, something that would be useful for us to think about when we think about tipping points and systemic change. Is what is the change we are trying to move towards? What does that look like? Because until we have a vision of that, it's very hard to kind of map the journey towards that point. So these should be distributed, network, people should feel empowered. Again, diversity, credibility, having resource, changing narratives, people's lives being better. Yeah, interesting. And how do we understand and measure that and tell stories about that? Non-violent civil disobedience, those things that might be seen as being successful. Legitimization of social movement, being emotionally intelligent. Again, yes, that we'll definitely need to talk about that. Achievements, followers, that idea of size can be something, and people's a sense of belonging. And Zizia in the chat, the means are the ends in the making. It's a really lovely way of putting it. Great, I'm sure we can continue. I'm going to move us on to, we've got two more, I think, yeah, one more question for now, which is, okay, so if we think about what the successful social movements might look like, if we're trying to create a positive change, what are the barriers in the way of social movements? So what could stop a social movement from having the change that it might want to create? Great, okay, fear, yeah, and that emotional response. Laws, policies, yeah, quite formal, rigid boundaries. Not having enough influence, being too exclusive. Fear, again, a common one. The patriarchy, absolutely, and these are the dominant systems that can reinforce the status quo. And the patriarchy is a system that we should definitely come back to later on. Allergy to cooperation, collaboration, yeah, definitely. Corruption, which could take many forms. Intolerance, vested interests, definitely. These are the kind of dampening feedback loops that we'll talk about a bit later. A lack of resource, time, money, conservatism, fear of change, fear of acknowledging problems. Yeah, governance, reputations, being reluctant to change, lack of trust, media, so how information is shared. Brilliant, loads of really good ideas here. Too many to go over, but these are absolutely things that we can reflect on later and build into this idea of how change does or doesn't happen from a perspective of tipping points. Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much for sharing those. I'm going to move us on, and I know there's loads in the chat. Thank you, and thank you, Deborah, for sharing the link again. I'm now going to just shift into a presentation into this idea of okay, what does tipping points actually mean? And I've taken some of this from very kind of relatively recent research, and I'm going to try and give a pretty concise summary. And I should say this session, as illustrated here, is part of a series of workshops that I've been running into how we can apply this framework in practice, looking at specific systems and sectors. So this is the 4th of 7. And at the end of this, I'll be taking all of the feedback and ideas that have come out of that and putting that into a report, which I will share with everybody here today. So tipping points. When we hear the idea of tipping points, for some it might be a concept you're very familiar with, but when we hear about it, it's often described in two ways. One, it's generally ecological, so it's a tipping point in the ecological systems of the world, and two, they tend to be negative. So examples here of deforestation, of ice melt, of changing weather seasons like monsoons. These tend to be the kind of things that we talk about when we think about tipping points. And there's the dominant research into this. It exists in this way. And this is reinforced. So this is some recent research from David Armstrong Mackay from the University of Exeter that was shared in The Guardian last month, which is looking at we're getting better and better at being able to measure these negative tipping points and understanding where is the point at which these things become irreversible, where the amount of deforestation or melting of a particular ice sheet or shifts in a monsoon season, where do they become unavoidable? And we're getting better and better at measuring those. However, this research was announced at the beginning of this conference in Exeter last month, which was called Tipping Points from Climate Crisis to Positive Transformation. And the idea here is, yes, we need to understand these negative tipping points and the ecological tipping points, but these aren't the only tipping points that are going on. They're not the only ones that we can understand and work with. We also want to be thinking about, well, what are the ones that are not just ecological, that are social, and what are the ones that are positive? As well, tipping points that might push us closer to where we actually want to be rather than further away from it. So this is all very new. There's a lot of research, a lot of interest going into this, and it's happening right now. So this was like a really good time to be asking these questions and making sure that the research matches up to the kind of information we need to be working with on the ground. So what do we do now? This is the question. How do we move from the research that's happening and put that into practice, create something that people can actually use? So this is where the positive tipping point frame comes into play. I really like this image, and I think this is an important place to start in thinking about complexity. Because tipping points, we're talking about systems, and systems are very complex. And as human beings, we're not always particularly good at thinking about complexity. It can be very easy to sort of sit in our boxes and think, okay, well, if we're A, we do this thing and we get to B. And sometimes that is true, but more often than not, the real world, as we open the door and look outside, is much more complex, hard to understand, and hard to influence in the way that we want. And this can be overwhelming. This can be paralyzing. This can sometimes make us feel like we're not having an impact or we don't know what we're supposed to do. But actually what we need is mechanisms and frameworks and ideas that can help us hold that uncertainty, accept it, and still work within it. So we don't pretend it's not there, and we don't pretend everything's really simple, and then only do things that exist in our small little box. So this is the idea, this is the principle of why I think this is really important. So an example, mutual aid groups. So there was a lot of interest in mutual aid groups in response to the COVID pandemic when that first started. And we saw communities around the world start to mobilize to start getting support to people who needed it, people who were vulnerable, who couldn't get outside, delivering medicines, delivering food. And this was an amazing thing to witness, but it didn't come from nowhere. While it suddenly became very, very visible and very noticeable, these things were the conditions for this change, for this shift, were already there. So in particular communities, you could look and see, well, there was already the local knowledge. So people already knew who lived where, who maybe was a bit more vulnerable. That information was there, that had been gathered, that had been shared. There were particular modes of communication that were already in place. So maybe there were WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups or more in-person forms of communication. But those channels were already there. They were created and they were ready to be used. Thirdly, there were people already had roles and there were processes. So people might know, okay, this needs to happen. I know who that person is going to be. That's the person who's going to do it. Maybe it's me, maybe it's somebody else. But again, these things were already in place for a different reason, in a different way, perhaps. But we were not starting from nothing. And another key part of this is that there was legitimacy. So the people who were offering help, or the structures that were offering help, were not coming from nowhere. People already had an idea of trusting them, of knowing who this person is that's offering me help, which means it's much more likely to happen and be positive and successful and impactful. So that legitimacy is not something that happens overnight. Really nice comment from Manda in the chat. Absolutely, there's a lot that Rebecca Solnit has written about this idea of in moments of adversity, we are able to respond, but we are able to respond if those conditions are in place. We have the mechanisms to do so. And really interesting now, there's just some research, very recent research, looking into mutual aid, and I'm just going to read this quote. Mutual aid offered by group-based models and social movement networks provides routes to community resilience that support responses to climate change focused on collective advocacy and care. Now, that's a fairly academic way of just saying these mutual aid groups have a really key role in climate response as well. So it doesn't stop there. So we'll talk briefly about where mutual aid groups might have emerged from, but also what they might lead on to. So it's not just COVID, it's not just pandemics, but resilience came up a lot in the Mentimeter poll. And that's something where these groups and these structures, these conditions can then respond to a new challenge that emerges. So we kind of understand this in principle, but what we need to do is really dig down into, well, what is going on? Why does this happen? Because if we can understand it better, that means we can reinforce it, we can build it, we can replicate it. So another example, moving away from the idea of social movements, but it's quite a famous one, and I think is quite useful to break down into, is this idea of electric vehicles. So whether or not you think that they are a key part of where we need to get to, electric vehicles are often held up as, okay, well, here's an example of a positive tipping point that we think has already happened. So what this graph is showing us is the proportion of new cars that are bought that are electric. So as you can see, Norway is way ahead with 64.5%, and the next closest is Germany with 13.6%. So that's a huge difference. So again, using this idea of tipping points, we can try and break down, well, why is that the case? What can we learn from what's going on in Norway, whether we want to learn about electric vehicles or any other type of social, ecological, or technological change? So first obvious example is, well, the price goes down. As more electric vehicles are created, they become cheaper, so they become more affordable. What else? Okay, so the quality goes up. As more are made, we get better at making them, and so the performance of those cars increases. As the quality goes up and the price goes down, these things become more desirable. So we want them more. Maybe we see other people doing them, and that makes us want it more as well. But this thing has to become desirable, whether it's electric vehicles, whether it's mutual aid groups, whether it's anything else. People have to want this change. If change is going to happen, there has to be something about it that is positive and desirable. Then accessibility goes up. This is really important. People need to be able to use this technology. The accessibility could be around the charging infrastructure. So can we actually charge these vehicles? So the more infrastructure there is, the more accessible this technology is. So but the key thing that differentiates Norway from many other places is the fact that they've implemented specific policies that make the cost of the alternative higher. So it's much more expensive to buy a petrol or a diesel car. Now, if that was done on its own, then there could have been potentially a lot of backlash to that. So people don't like being told what to do. They don't like things that they're already doing becoming more expensive. But because of all of the other things were already in place, these things were desirable, they were accessible. When that trigger comes in of a tax that makes the alternative much more expensive, that's when we can see a trigger into a new system. And that is arguably what has led to electric vehicles becoming the dominant form of new cars being bought in Norway. So it's really useful to think about this as an example of how these changes can happen. But that's not all. There's clearly more happening here, and we don't want to break it down into just 5 different things that are going on. there is more, but it's a good example of how we can start looking at that change. Okay, so a really key part of this is when we think about policies or triggers, or okay, well, let's make this more expensive. It can be very easy to think about tipping points as just a kind of a lever, and if we push the lever in the right place, we'll get the change that we want. But it's really important that we don't oversimplify it in that way. This is a quote from Professor Frank Giles from the University of Manchester from the conference we had in Exeter. The thing that's really appealing to policymakers is the idea that we only have to do something really small, and then we see these huge effects, which is pretty misleading because it's primarily the efforts leading up to the tipping point where a lot of effort will actually be needed. So this is really important. This is a key part of the idea of tipping points, is it's not just that last thing that happens, that last trigger, whether it's a policy or a new invention or something like that. It's all of the work that's gone up to that point. That is the key thing, and that is the thing that defines whether or not a system will tip from one state into another. So here is a simplified version of the model, and I'll talk through this and I'll come back to it in a few different ways. But you can see at its simplest level, it's very much not a case of we move simply from A to B. You can see between A and B, there's this hill, there's this curve. And we have to get to this tipping point in order to reach B. But this steep curve, this steep line from the first point, the first system, there's a lot of resistance there. So you might push this system, try and push it up to the tipping point, but if you don't reach there, it's going to roll back down. So a key part of this idea of a tipping point is we have resistance and then we have momentum. So there's resistance up until the point where we reach that tipping point. And then once we have reached it, we then enter a state of momentum where we haven't reached the new system that we want, but we're in a state where the momentum of the change will carry us into that. We don't need to do anything more. There's just cascades of new impacts and new things that happen that push us towards that new system, that base and B where we want to be. So this is a kind of a fairly simplified way of understanding it. So resistance and then momentum. So I wanted to touch on a couple of live things that are happening now, again, as examples of how do we put this into practice? How do we think about that? So here's one example. So this is from the UK, polling suggesting that there's public support for direct action around environmental activism. So here quoting 2/3 of people backing non-violent direct action. And then here's another one very recently. This is a headline talking about the recent elections in Brazil around and framing it as Brazilians delivering this win and a specific rejection of far-right politics. So here are two ideas. One is a growing public support for non-violent action, and then another one suggesting a kind of a social movement in a democratic process, in an election, to move away from a specific type of politics, of far-right politics. And so, you know, whether or not you agree with these headlines and what they're saying, and obviously they're coming from a very specific place, they raise a question of, well, are these tipping points, are these things that are happening? So within the UK or elsewhere, this idea of more support for environmental action, is that a tipping point? At what point will we reach that state where we're not having to push against resistance anymore and we're building momentum instead? And in terms of an election is really an easy thing to think of in terms of a tipping point, because a system changes very, very quickly, but we don't yet know what that means. So is that a tipping point, or is it part of a wider movement towards change? So I'm trying to purposely make this slightly more complicated because we really need to break it down and we can't afford to oversimplify these ideas. So for example, both of these ideas, we might get it nearly towards that tipping point, but then we might meet so much resistance that these things then come back to the way they were. So maybe people agree with direct action up to a point, but then they think, actually, no, that's enough. I just want to be able to drive my car or do my thing. And we might see that, okay, well, we have a new person in this particular government, in this particular country. but maybe they're not actually able to do the things that they say they're going to do, or maybe we still have the status quo in place. So that resistance can push us back down towards the original state. So what is it that's going to build us momentum to get into the new place that we want to be, that new system? So to break that down into more detail, to think about what exactly is going on here, this is the process and the framework that comes from the research that's been done. I think is a helpful way to conceptualize, well, how is this change taking place? So this first point is we need to create the conditions for change. So whatever the change we want to happen, those conditions need to be in place. So that change isn't going to come out of just anywhere. And what we need then is reinforcing feedbacks that strengthen that change, that push against the resistance that is trying to keep us where we are. So here, this is visualized by the idea of kind of pushing up this first basin, this left-hand side of the diagram. So you can see that pushing it up reduces the resistance, so it makes it easier for that state to move into another state. So that's what we need. We need those reinforcing feedbacks that make it easier and reduce that resistance. And then finally, we find that trigger. And again, represented here, that trigger is pushing the state up so that we move from resistance to momentum. Now gravity takes over, whatever that might be in the metaphor, and moves that system from the original state to a new state. So we have the conditions, we have those feedbacks, and we have the trigger. So that is the kind of the summary of how the framework looks in real life. So to break that down in a bit more detail, and I'll share all of this afterwards, so don't feel like you have to write anything down, but this is just a way to kind of break down how we can think about these things in practice. So conditions for change, what could those be? There's a few different ways we could think about it. So we could think about it in terms of the number of people. And you might think, oh, well, the more people involved, the better. But actually what we sometimes see is if you start with a smaller population size, change can be more likely to happen because you don't need so many people to be part of the change for it to tip. So actually that population size, it might be sometimes feel counterintuitive. Secondly, people need access to information. So whatever the change is, it needs to be clear. What is it that we're trying to do? It needs to be affordable. That could be about money, but it also could be about time or any other type of resource. Again, it needs to be quality, like with the electric vehicles. It needs to be something that people want and is desirable, and it needs to be accessible to people. So there are obviously more than this. This is just a way of kind of breaking it down into a few simple ideas, but these conditions need to be in place. And then the feedback loops. So here are some examples of what those could look like. So one, critical mass, that came up in the Mentimeter poll. If you get enough people doing something, it really builds that momentum and it's very hard to stop. Economies of scale is this idea of the more we do something, the easier it becomes, the cheaper it becomes, maybe in time, maybe in money. Learning by doing, it's this idea the more we do something, the better at it we get. So we practice. And so it's a feedback loop of pushing against that resistance that is kind of trying to keep the change away. Coordination is a great one for social movements, this idea of as more people who are cultivating the right conditions come together, that strengthens those conditions, that pushes back against that resistance to change. And social networks, which might be digital social networks, but it might also be just the way that information moves within a community or a network or a group. So social movements is a really key example of that. And then once the feedback loops have done enough and pushed against that resistance, then the system is ready for a trigger. And so here are some examples of what triggers might be. We could look at innovation. So this could be a new technology that comes in, but it could also be a social innovation. It could be a new policy that comes in from a government or a new law. It could be behavior change that happens on a large scale. It could be a large investment. That could be investment of time. It could be investment of money. Or it could be new information that comes to light. Suddenly something new happens. We get new information and that can trigger the change that's been building up throughout the rest of this process. So this is, in summary, this is the framework, and this is the idea that we want to practice and try out and see how this works as a way of understanding how systemic change might be taking place and where we can locate ourselves within that system. But a couple of things that I just want to mention before I finish and we start looking at Transition Network as a live example are a few ways in which we need to think about the larger complexity. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to push into Basin B, into this new state, but imagine this not as a 2D image, but as a 3D image. And if we roll this ball to the top of a hill, yes, it might tip into where we want, but it also could tip into any of these other states. And so this is something that's really important to think about, because once that tipping point has been reached, change is going to happen, but is it definitely going to be the change that we want? In the session we ran on climate justice, one of the really interesting things that came out of that was, well, if we're pushing for change, it's often the dominant emergent system that is more likely to be tipped into. And at the moment, you could argue in a lot of ways that that is fascism. So if we push for change, but we're not cautious about what change that is going to be, then we could end up in somewhere that we don't want. So these alternative new states might be ones that are at risk of being co-opted by the dominant power, or otherwise not be desirable. So it's really important that we think about this point here that I've highlighted in this top circle. This is the point of early warning indicators. So this is a point where we start to notice that the existing system or the existing regime is starting to lose stability. So a change is coming. We've almost reached that tipping point. And so those examples are shared before around responses to direct action or political events. These could be early warning indicators. And so while we really need to think about the kind of the wider concept of change, these moments are really important to notice. Because change in and of itself is not always enough. It's not always what we want. And so again, this framework can be a helpful way of thinking, well, not just are we tipping into a new state, but what might that state be and how do we influence that as much as possible? So I've just talked at you a lot. I hope that made sense, and I'd welcome any specific questions about that. And I see there's been lots of conversation and chat, which is excellent. But I want to move on to specifics and onto kind of the context of social movements now. So I'm going to welcome Deborah to join me and introduce the Transition Network, and then we're going to start talking about this idea of, well, how can the idea of positive tipping points be applied to Transition Network as a social movement? So Deborah, welcome.
Hey everyone, thanks Peter, and several of my colleagues from Transition Network are here this evening as well, so please do feel free to weigh in after what I've said if you want to add something. And it's also lovely to see so many people from transition groups and other aligned sort of grassroots community groups, so this is very exciting. Yeah, so I attended this the Tipping Points conference in Exeter because Peter is linked with Transition Network. He's on our board of trustees. And I found it really fascinating to think about Transition Network in relationship with this tipping points and positive tipping points idea. So I'm sure many of you know about transition already because you're from transition groups or partnering with transition groups. But for those that don't, so Transition Network is the support charity that based in the UK, but supporting the international transition or transition towns movement. And that movement started back in 2006 in Totnes, was founded by Rob Hopkins and several other colleagues of his, and has become a global movement that's now in, I think, around 45 to 50 countries. And we have, is it 23 or 26 regional and national and international hubs? But something like that, between 23 and 26. Can't remember what the latest number was at the recent, most recent number. So it's a movement that has continued to develop and expand. It's a very grassroots movement with people leading a huge variety of interesting projects in their local communities, local food, local energy, local transport, mutual aid, and many other things. And many of you are involved in doing that, and we're very grateful to you. So yeah, we're a support charity that helps build the infrastructure for that movement to understand itself and share and learn. and hopefully funnels some useful resources its way. We're not a top-down charity. We try and be a, more of a support organisation and hub. So maybe it's useful for me to say, is that enough on Transition Network and the transition movement? Okay, good. If anyone wants to say anything more about transition in the chat, please do, those of you that are involved at Transition Network or the movement level. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, we started doing a piece of evaluation work to look at the impact, potential and relevance of transition. And we gathered lots of stories from around the movement. I think we had about 400 survey responses, and we did several focus groups online, sort of webinars with people from all over the world. And we did about 25 interviews with kind of key partners and movers and shakers in the transition movement. And this gave us a bit more of a view on sort of what was happening in the movement in terms of sort of where the impacts were being felt and what some of the patterns were that were emerging. And interestingly, we did that research kind of in the middle of COVID and various other crises that were unfolding, whether that was social unrest or kind of severe weather and forest fires. And so it was very interesting to see what was happening. And what Peter was talking about there in terms of, so maybe it's best to just give a couple of specific examples. So that idea of groups thinking that maybe they're not having that much impact, or maybe what they're doing is mostly kind of social and connective, and they're wondering whether their projects are really having an impact. When they hit those crisis moments, we really did see in stories from lots of different groups that suddenly those foundations, those conditions they'd been creating in the local community were really, really important in helping them respond to those crises. So with COVID in Italy, where there were very active transition groups, we saw sort of rapid activation of mutual aid and distribution of food and mapping where vulnerable people were and making sure that they got support before the local councils could respond. In Japan, we heard really interesting stories about when they had the earthquake and the nuclear event and the tsunami, very similar things happening, transition groups being able to activate and support people in those communities. Similar things in Brazil, where COVID really hit people living in the favelas really hard, like the gig economy and all the kind of local work, disappearing. But because there was such a diverse mix of people from different socioeconomic kind of situations in the transition groups, there was the ability for people to mobilize and support those people that had lost their jobs and make sure that they were getting some support. And many more stories like that, which was really good to hear. So we've become very interested in this whole idea of what is it that creates the conditions for this kind of resilience. And then also not just disturbance, but also opportunities. So we've seen in places where opportunities like cities declaring climate emergency, where there were already transition groups in place that had built trust and relationships with local councils, like in the city of Bonn in Germany, that because those relationships were already there, even if it was through kind of smaller projects that they maybe didn't think were that kind of significant, because that was already there once the council declared climate emergency, the transition group were able to go to the council and say, do you know what to do next, and would you like some help? And the council said yes. And now the city of Bonn and the transition group there are involved in a multiple year citywide consultation process. Transition group's getting really good funding and has some paid roles to help deliver that. And again, they were saying they didn't think that would have happened had they not had created these conditions of trust and smaller projects and networks and so on, and previous partnerships. So yeah, we're moving forward into doing more work, looking at what are the significant impacts around the movement and how do we support those and support the movement to support itself, and understanding what these conditions are, how we can develop them, and how we can identify those crisis and opportunity moments where local groups can help guide that ball we were seeing in the pictures into the basin that we want it to go in, rather than being co-opted into one of those kinds of changes that we don't want. Is there anything else that you wanted me to talk about, Peter, in relation to transition, or should we just move on to the participatory bit?
Yeah, I think, but I would definitely echo. I think just reinforce what you said, as all of those things you talked about are really good examples of conditions, the conditions for change being in place. So that diversity, the trust, the relationships being in place. I think those are really good practical examples of how a group can can contribute towards the potential for change without feeling responsible for having to take on this huge systemic shift that feels out of reach for all of us. But also, I think, touches on the wider question of social movements more broadly, of the strength of a network like Transition, like other social movements, whereby you can be part of it, but you don't have to be able to see the whole picture.
And two other things just to say about that you and I spoke about the other day was that in that Bonn example, that was also facilitated by what other parts of other social movement groups were doing. So Fridays for the Future and Extinction Rebellion putting pressure on, helping to lead to those climate change declarations. And that's kind of their part of the system, is to put the pressure on. But then the local community groups have a different role in that kind of social change, to then step in and be able to say, well, what should we do locally, and already have those relationships in place and maybe be a bit less political or seen as less risky or something to collaborate with. So that is also interesting, that we can take different roles in that kind of ecosystem of change making. And the other thing that we saw being a really important pattern was where there'd been diverse partnerships already. So in California and other groups, we saw that where transitioners had linked up with social justice groups, with local indigenous groups, with all sorts of different, groups that were doing good work, that when those opportunities and crises came again, they were in a better situation to respond or take advantage of those opportunities. I want to reference, so thank you for putting the link to Transition on the website there. If you want to find out more about transition groups and transition resources, you can go to our website, and we've got a map of all the different groups, and we've got a huge ton of free resources for doing these sorts of projects in your area. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that we do have kind of a multimedia presentation of the results from the evaluation work with some of these stories in there, and I'll put the link in the chat to that. It's a Canva presentation. So there's like little videos and interviews and things with people from some of these projects. And the last thing I'll put in the chat is a series of resources, which I thought was fascinating recently, from a professor at Northeastern University that's done a huge amount of research on recovery and resilience in the face of disasters. And he was very surprised. He originally had his home destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and then got into doing, he was already in public policy, and he got into this work after that. And over again, what he found, he thought he would find that resilience and recovery from disaster would be down to how severe it was, in certain neighborhoods, how much aid came, how much wealth there was in the local area, all these other kinds of conditions. And over again, what he found was that the most important determining factor of resilience and recovery was how strong the social networks were in those neighborhoods and in those communities. So that's really, really interesting. And now the other half of his research is going into doing all sorts of things that we would recognize as transition activities, like creating community hubs, local economies, and all that sort of thing. And very interesting stuff. So I'll post some of his work there, because it's a nice way to give some credibility to things we've been knowing and saying for a while, those of us that are doing this community-based work.
Thanks, Debs. And I think there's, again, a couple of things in there that feel like really good examples, but also just wanting to step back a little bit, thinking about, why is it that Transition Network has been so successful as a social movement? And I use the word successful quite cautiously, because it's a very loaded word, and who's to say, but the fact that it has lasted for a significant period of time, it clearly does have a critical mass behind it. And a lot of other social movements have kind of been and gone. And time, duration, length, lifespan is not an indicator of success. Transition Network could disappear tomorrow, and that wouldn't mean it hasn't been successful. But I think there's lots of things that can be learned from that as a social movement, and again, thinking about its influence on systemic change, and how, but also the role it plays in that wider ecosystem. So you talked about Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, other groups that serve different functions. I think one of the things that's quite useful with the positive tipping points framework is to locate the priorities and the vision and the work of a specific movement in the wider context of other social movements, and how they can find common ground, which can sometimes be quite difficult to locate, because we might not be working towards the exact same vision. But one of the things about tipping points is, well, if we can work towards that tipping point and have some idea of the change that might be coming as a result of it, that's something that there's a lot of collaborative opportunities within that as an idea. We can talk a little bit more in the breakout rooms around how clear that vision might be of what is it that we're trying to tip into. I think the links that you put there are really good readings, and I'll make sure to send them in the follow-up email as well. So I'll capture all of those links. Could you say, Deb, something as well about the sort of the inner side of transition as well? Because I think that's something, the sort of the emotional side of change is something that can often get left out of models like this, where we're thinking about what needs to happen to create change. But actually, I think certainly what's come out of the previous workshops is this idea of we need to have that emotional connection, as well as the infrastructure, the technology, the policy, all of those things. But it's sometimes hard to see how they all fit together. But could you say just a little bit about, what the kind of the inner transition work is and why that is important to the network?
Sure. And again, I'd invite any of my colleagues to speak up after me. So right from the beginning, there's been a strong kind of focus in transition in the kind of inner dimensions. So the personal, the relational, and the kind of attitudinal changes that are needed, all of those kind of inner dimensions of change, sort of what's the personal, and that's because one of the founders was Sophie Banks, who really kind of gave a lot of attention to this and helped create lots of resources and trainings around inner transition. So really looking at sort of what's the personal journey we need to go on around our emotions and our personal resilience and how we feel in response to these crises and the actions we might need to take, and how do we develop that kind of emotional intelligence and that kind of support for ourselves and each other to move through those difficult emotions. And then also what also kind of came out of inner is that there's these three levels: the kind of personal, relational, and then kind of like systemic. So that relational level is sort of how do we relate with each other and how do we navigate the tensions and difficulties and sensitivities that can come up between us when we're working on these difficult subjects, often without much resources, volunteers, with people that we don't know very well, and we might have differing opinions. So there's been a lot of work around sort of healthy groups and conflict resilience and how to make good decisions and run good meetings. And that all kind of relates to that side of inner transformation around how we relate with each other and relate in groups and work together well and collaborate and so on. And then that systemic level, is really just sort of looking at how do we transform our attitudes and beliefs and those attitudes, beliefs, and the sort of dominant stories in society? How do we change the paradigm about how we think about what's normal in culture and what's normal in how we design systems? And that's a kind of inner level too, because it's all about mindset change or worldview change. So how do we, and I think some of you were talking about that in the chat earlier, about it's really about changing our mindset and changing the dominant culture. So those are all levels of inner that we're interested in transition. And again, there's some really great resources on inner transition that have been developed over the years, including lots recently on conflict resilience and personal resilience and things like that might be useful to your groups. Whatever you're involved in, doesn't have to be transition. We hope some of those resources might be useful to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's loads in the chat. Thanks, John, for just sharing a few. And as I said, I'll make sure those are captured and shared. So I want to just pause here and invite if anyone's got any anything they'd like to share. So it can either be a question about anything that's come up so far that needs a bit more clarification or exploration, or any examples from your personal experience that you've seen that you'd like to share, or wondering how that fits into this process. So we'll get a chance to do that collectively in breakout rooms in just a little bit. But I'm wondering if there are any things that'd be useful to share, or any things that require a bit of clarification before we continue. Zizi, do you want to jump in here?
A lot of groups that I've been involved in have flourished for a little while and then fizzled out. So what stops a group from sort of losing energy and fizzling out?
Yeah, really good question. That I think goes beyond tipping points, but there's a couple of things that feel relevant there. One is that thing we kind of already discussed about a group fizzling out isn't necessarily failure and isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, if something can exist and can help cultivate the right conditions for change and then disappear, that can still be a really powerful action. And when you think about all of the component parts of that group, they haven't disappeared. It's just that temporary structure of the group has disappeared, but the people are still there. The relationships might still be there. Communication systems might still be there. And the impact that that group has had in whether it's run events or shared information, those things are still within that community. And so they can still be triggered. They can still be reinforced by feedback loops. So I think from that perspective, it's important to not lose hope and not see that kind of limited lifespan of a specific framework as a negative thing. But I do think, yeah, I mean, within this framework, you could look at, well, what might make a particular group or movement or structure thrive or be more resilient, whether it's about, do people have the agency, the autonomy within that? So I think you could directly apply the positive tipping points framework and look at the conditions for change. If the change you want to see is a resilient, thriving group emerging, what are the conditions? Is being part of that group desirable, accessible, affordable? All of these different things. And what are the feedback loops within it? Joy came up as a really key idea earlier in the Mentimeter. Joy is a great, reinforcing feedback loop, making people want to stay and derive really positive experiences from it. So I don't think there's one right answer, but I do think that's a good example of where using the positive tipping points framework, you can take a systemic view to try and answer questions like that. There's a question from Ella in the chat. I'd like to ask the presenters how social tipping point ideas deal with messiness in political world. As described, the ideas seem quite linear. Debs, I'd welcome your thoughts on that. I'll just initially just on the linear point, absolutely. And just like that image of the cartoon of the person stepping outside the box with everything being a bit incomprehensible. This is just a model, and the famous saying, all models are wrong and some are useful. Every model tries to take complexity and make it simpler so that we can deal with it. And absolutely, even though I think the tipping points idea doesn't have to be linear, it is more linear than the real world. So it's difficult. It's not easy to apply. It's not a plaster. It's not something you can just drag and drop onto any situation and it will give you the right answer. It's not, a magic bullet in that response. But I think it certainly can help with messiness because it can help us map out that ecosystem and understand what is happening and maybe not control the system, but like with the early warning indicators, thinking about how close might we be to a tipping point and to a change. And if there was a tipping point tomorrow, and you could, say, yeah, maybe that's a political change, maybe that's a new a law that comes in or a new invention that's created. If that happened tomorrow, what system would we tip into? Because what conditions are in place right now? And I think that's where it can help us start to understand things in that way, which is moving away from a kind of a linear this to that, and it's locating ourselves within a much broader system of space, but also time. Let's not forget what's happened before, because those are the conditions that's going to affect where we get to next. Debs, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
I'm not sure if I'm enough of an expert in either politics or tipping points yet to talk about that specifically. I can talk a little bit about what gives me hope in the kind of context of messiness and complexity anyway, and just generally in relation to this research and this framework, which is that I sort of, I think what the research gives us, because the research has been informed by, a lot of case studies and evidence and research, so there's science behind this that shows that tipping points are a real thing in terms of how change happens either in nature or in societies. In any complex adaptive system, change happens in certain ways that we can map and learn about. And this idea of something going through a steady state for a while and then becoming kind of sort of chaotic, or disruption starting to happen and then there being some kind of tip into a new state, that shows up in nature and it shows up in all other sort of complex systems, including human society and human culture. So it just gives me hope to understand that, and then to understand that we can have some influence on that, that we can actually work as social movements to create the conditions that when the disruptions are happening, the instability is happening in the dominant systems, like is happening in many political situations in many countries, that the work we're doing in our social movements can have an influence in helping to tip us into a more desirable state rather than a less desirable state. And that just gives me a bit of a framework and a bit of, I guess, an evidence base for what we're trying to do. So that's why I find it useful. And I in relation to politics, Peter said something interesting to me, which was, I know you mentioned it today, which is, if we just push for political change, we may get more fascism, more extreme right-wing, ideology, more dominance, more control. But if we push for change and we're a living lab, we're demonstrating the changes we want in terms of how we're doing governance and decision-making and citizens' assemblies and political process with a small p, we're creating conditions, we're demonstrating alternatives where maybe there's more likelihood that we get the change that we want rather than change that we don't want. So I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of what resonates with me and makes me think this is helpful.
No, that's great.
Mike, ask Mike. He knows much more about politics than me.
I think Hillary's got a hand up first, and then I'll come to Mike after that.
Yeah, it was just a very small observation. I think this idea around the tipping points and the kind of the range of different things that that can be coming out of the work that you do, which contributes to tipping points, frees you up from worrying that a particular action is achieving a particular thing. So, for example, if we're working locally in Tooting, I always have this sense that so long as we're building connections between people and we're working on projects together that will help build trust and connection, even if the project doesn't quite work out how you wanted it to in the first place, your kind of co-benefit is that you're building the connections. And so it frees you up a bit to just get on with doing the work and know that you're doing several things at one time. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, that's great. And that I think reinforces conversations we're having with funders at the moment, who I think, there's a lot of quite radical funders who want to be funding this sort of stuff that's hard to measure, but that does contribute towards systemic change, but they don't currently have the mechanisms to do it. So I think that's a shift we're noticing as well. Mike.
Yeah, just in terms of I suppose when we talk about positive tipping points, I mean, it's just a subjective thing in a way. A tipping point's a tipping point in some ways. Where it goes is where it goes somewhere and you'll go, oh, that was positive, or that wasn't, like you can look at Brazil recently, a positive tipping point that we just had is like Lula's now back in power. Hopefully that will be better than Bolsonaro. But I suppose that within complex systems, I think sometimes, governments have some power, of course they do, but I don't think they have as much power. They have power to do very simple, blunt things a lot of the time. I remember watching the really good documentary, The Accidental Anarchist, about the guy Carne Ross, who used to work for the Foreign Office and then just sort of rejected it all. And one of the things he said about complex systems in that was that, it's very easy to go to war, a government to go to war, because that's a simple thing to do. You've got your army and you just go in, it creates a massively complex situation. But the act of going to war is quite simple in a way, because you can do that. But in terms of complex systems, there's a very complex interplay a lot of the time between what the state is trying to do, what society is doing, what all the different actors are doing within society. And I think that's where stuff gets quite interesting. I remember reading some stuff by this guy Nicholas Luhmann, who talks about all these different systems having boundaries, like transition, rubbing up against the local council a bit, and then at that tension, that rubbing point, interesting things can happen because they're rubbing against each other. But the idea that transition might take over the council probably isn't going to happen at the moment. No, who knows? Because you have that rubbing, and that tension happening, and that can result in different relationships forming. So sometimes I think, you know, the more I've read about complexity and systems thinking, which relates to a lot of the tipping point stuff, the more it's like you begin to sort of think about, you know, what are these where are the leverage points to put your effort to get what you feel is the maximum potential impact to, I suppose, then contribute towards that tipping point happening. And that diagram you showed earlier, the one with the two like U shapes bit where you hit the tipping point and it goes back down again, reminds me a lot of the 3 horizons framework, which is where you have horizon 1, which is like business as usual, and then you've got horizon, I think it's horizon 3 is where you want to get to, is like your vision, and horizon 2 is the bit which is riding the two, almost surfing the wave between the two, and it's like that's sort of very similar to this tipping points thing, and transition is very much, you know, seen as a what they call a horizon 2 activity. It's like we're trying to create stuff in the existing system to get to that horizon 3 vision, but at the same time that can get co-opted or it can get absorbed by horizon 1, which is the existing system. So yeah, I think it is complex, and we shouldn't give like dominant forces as much power. I think the more that we give them power, the less maybe we feel we have power. So sometimes I think it's good to sometimes think, yeah, they're just complex systems and it could just tip over. So let's just keep going. let's keep doing our thing and thinking, but think smart about it, I suppose, is the thing.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And if you can share any links to anything you've shared in the chat, I'll collect those all later. But I think, you know, you referenced that there is a lot of thinking about here. The positive tipping points idea is not inherently new. I think it's a new way of sort of packaging these ideas. And I just, before we move on, respond to a few comments in the chat I think are important before we get into breakout rooms. There are a couple about the sort of simplicity of it, of, you know, this is it could be overly simple, and I think that's absolutely true. But there's two things. One is, you know, I'm presenting a fairly simplified version of this because I think it's a helpful way to start thinking about it, and there is more complexity. We can build that up as we go. And the second thing is, and responding to I think there was a comment from Jenny, you know, is there other examples of where this model has been deliberately introduced to create a tipping point? No, because it's new. This is very new research. This is a new framework that's being developed. So we can apply it to retrospectively, but we're only just starting to understand how could we use this to, you know, to more strategically influence where we are going now. That opens a lot of questions. There's some really good comments and questions around, you know, the electric vehicle example I shared earlier. And, you know, is that a positive tipping point? Is our electric vehicles what we want? And obviously positive and negative is a massively oversimplified binary, you know, way of looking at the world. And actually what we need to get to is a more complex way of a nuanced response of, well, what is good? Who decides what is good? Or what is positive or what is not? Again, I think there was there's a point in the chat from Greg around these could be applied to conservative movements. They could be used to push us towards fascism. So absolutely, you know, one person's positive might be someone else's negative. So this is just a framework that we can use, we can adapt, and we can make sure that it's as useful as possible for the kind of positive change that we know we need to see on a planetary social level. I may have missed other things. I'll capture all of the comments in the chat, and I can respond to anything that I've missed. But I'm keen now to move us into breakout rooms to really get a chance to practice playing around with this. So what I'm going to do in just a minute is share a link to this Jamboard, and I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. And invite you to, the first kind of question is, how can you map the actions or the work that whatever it is that you are doing or you are interested in as a sort of social movement, how can you map the actions that you're taking onto this model? So remembering, you know, the examples Debs was sharing and the ideas around mutual aid as examples of creating conditions, potentially reinforcing feedbacks, and then what might be the triggers that you would want in order to tip us into a new system, or to change the system in the way that you want to see it. And welcome back, everyone. Apologies to those who were removed from your room mid sentence, as is always the way. But I'd love to hear some feedback, or some ideas or comments from that process. Both what were some of the ideas that came up, but also reflections on the framework, having had a chance to use it, in terms of what felt like it made sense, what's missing from these ideas. We've already talked about, you know, the need for simplicity to start with, but yeah, it'd be really good to hear from any of the groups about you know, how those conversations went.
I can have a go at trying to summarize from our group if they give me permission to do so, if they're happy about that. I took a few notes. Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So obviously we wanted lots more time if we were going to get into the whole framework. We really only had time to start exploring the conditions for change part of the framework. And I think there were a couple of things that came out. One was that just having a single word for each thing, it's hard to know what that really describes, what kinds of things would come under the word quality, or what would come under the word accessibility. So it's almost like just having one word, it's difficult to apply the framework because it could mean so many different things. And John was making a comment at the end as well about those things can point to very different kind of apples and pears type of thing. And there's actually quite a lot of them, and they're quite broad concepts that could cover many, many things. So there was something just about the sort of framework in terms of applicability and thinking about that. But when we actually just had a kind of free-form conversation about what are the conditions that we've seen facilitate change in our projects, there were concepts such as supporting people to feel confident to talk about the changes that they're making and share those changes, rather than feeling they need to hide those changes or be ashamed of them or be embarrassed by them. So how do those of us working on these, like maybe as support organizations or in a transition group or in a community organization, how do we support other people in the local community to talk about what they're doing and feel proud of it and have that confidence to share it? That was one thing. We talked a lot about how numbers of people is one thing and it's useful, but it's the quality of the connections and the level of engagement and the kind of long-term motivation or engagement or participation, and how people get along and collaborate and work together can be much more important than the number of people in terms of creating conditions for change. So there was the idea of, you know, mile deep and an inch wide can be just as good as the other way around, or even better. And then we looked at some of the challenges as well, in terms of if there's a whole bunch of different diverse perspectives sort of going towards system change, there'll be lots of tensions between those different groups, you know, if it's like loggers and green lobby groups. And so how do we actually, if we're going to create conditions for change, how do we actually work with really diverse perspectives, people believing different kinds of science? And there was a comment that if you have one influential insider in a kind of diverse, you know, across diverse groups. So if someone, the example right at the end was, you might have loggers that are saying we've logged this way for years and this is the best thing for the environment, but then, and the green groups are pressuring them to do something different. But if one of the loggers actually says, actually, doing it this way could be good for us and good for the environment, and then the long term, you know, that's much more influential. So something about influential insiders came up at the end as an interesting sort of condition for change. Have I represented most of what we said? Do my group want to add anything? Okay, I'm getting a few thumbs up, so that's good. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Hilary. Oh, sorry, I thought I saw your hand, Hilary. Nicola, I think I saw your hand instead.
Oh, I was going to ask Jenny if she might share some of the things in our group that she talked about, the psychology of change, which I found very interesting, and then also later on about the importance of positive vision to work towards.
Thank you. Yeah, two things I said. One was that when we talk about behavior change, I think there's a very common view that you have to change people's attitudes and intentions, and then their behavior changes. But there's a lot of evidence that if you create the conditions for people's behavior to change, for example, for them to do recycling or wear seatbelts or whatever, attitudes change. As we're made to change our behavior, in a sense, attitudes change. So if there was, I don't know, better public transport, our attitudes to public transport would change. So it's a two-way street. I'm not entirely, I think that, yeah, that came up in context of behavior change. And in terms of desirability, I think for me, one of the great strengths of the transition movement is that it's really saying to people, we're not asking you to give things up and live a terribly restricted life, but a sustainable future would be a better future, a happier, a more fulfilling, rewarding future. I think is that what you're referring to? Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jenny. Any other reflections or comments or questions from the breakout rooms? Yeah, Hilary.
I wanted to say something that wasn't actually something that came up in the breakout room. I hope that's not cheating. There's some research that's been done by Common Cause Foundation that shows that they look into our values, and they found that globally people have a very common set of values that they hold in common, which are very much around community and compassion for each other and support for each other. And I think that showed in the things that Peter was saying earlier about these groups that kind of almost came from nowhere apparently during COVID. But weirdly and conversely, the same percentage of us, about 75% who hold these values, also believe that other people don't have them. And they believe that this mismatch, which it comes from things like the media, it comes from advertising, it comes from us being constantly told that these are not the values that we have. And it's in that gap, people are less likely to volunteer, they're less likely to get engaged, they're less likely to actually get active. And so a lot of what we can do through this kind of work is to show people doing stuff. You know, we talked in our group about giving people the opportunity to move with their urge to act. So, and giving people agency. And so we're trying to kind of put this way of doing, you know, getting on with trying to change things together. And by doing that visibly, other people will go, actually, I kind of want to do that as well. But and it'll break down that I'll put the research in the chat. It breaks down that misperception that other people care, and it allows people to step up with some agency as well. I'll pop that in the chat.
Brilliant.
And apologies for not feeding it. If anyone from my group would like to feed in, do feel free.
Thank you. Mike.
Yeah, just adding on to that about the Common Cause research, because what it found was that transition as an activity crossed over from like the sort of more conservative sort of values to more radical values, and many other social movements are situated either in one or the other, and there has been an argument that the combination of those two, because you have like the focus on community resilience and that sort of sense of belonging at that level, and at the same time sort of radical responses. But yeah, there has been like arguments that that's why transition has had the longevity, because it has been able to bring together those two sort of what are sort of quite polar-ish opposites on the Common Cause thing, when you see the framework. So that's quite interesting. I was thinking about that actually when you were chatting earlier, Peter, about why maybe has transition continued in the way it does. And I know from being in contact with lots of different groups that many groups that there's so many different flavors of transition when you look at all what the groups are like. You know, no group is the same. Literally, has been my experience. They all have their own identity and own sort of ideas about things, and maybe that's why it can be such a broad church in some ways, which sort of also ties into what you're saying, Hilary, about it's the potential to bring people together and have those conversations that maybe is part of its strength.
Thanks, Mike. And thanks to everyone putting links and resources, further reading in the chat. There's a few things in there, and if anybody else wants to jump in, please do, before we go back into breakout rooms, that I think are really important to bring out. This idea of the kind of the Common Cause values. There's also this idea of the spiral of silence, of, you know, many more people support action on climate change, but because people don't talk about it, people think other people don't think it's important. And I think that can be a helpful way to think about tipping points, or think about, in order then to actually create change, it's almost like, as has been said, kind of demonstrating that will is there. And so you're not actually really changing anything. You're not changing people's opinions or values. You're just kind of creating conditions in which those opinions can be shared. You're almost like kind of cultivating a garden where these ideas can flourish and people can see them. And so I think that's again another helpful way that I think the framework can be useful, because it helps us feel like we don't all have to be working towards, where's the biggest lever? What's the biggest single impact we can make with one action? It's what do we have around us? What are the conditions? Are they in place? And if they're not, how do we help them emerge? How do we make them more visible? And I think that touched on a lot of the ideas that have been said about working across diversity, behavior change, increasing confidence of people. And just to reflect on that point around the framework and most of these conditions and frameworks being feedbacks being one word, there's obviously a lot more detail we could go into, and they are absolutely not exhaustive. They're just examples of the kind of things you could see. So I would encourage you to to kind of play around with them and interpret them in whichever way you want. There is no right or wrong answer to this. And this is one thing I think it's really important that we collectively bring into this research as it evolves, and these resources as they evolve, to make sure they don't just become a list of words that might not actually mean anything to people, and might be very biased towards the particular perspective of the people who have written those words or chosen those icons, for example, that articulate them. So, this is a space that all of the ideas and feedback that comes out of these workshops will be going back to this very active research and making sure that this is inclusive and collaborative. I want to send us back into the rooms again, and feel free to continue the conversations that you were on. But one potential question I might pose is to start to think about, well, what's missing? So not just what is already there, what are the conditions that are in place from the work that you're doing or what you're seeing or the feedback loops? What is not there? What are the conditions that you feel are missing from the kind of change that you're hoping to create? And again, that can be a helpful way to think about where does energy need to be put into, but also what are it can be helpful to think about maybe the dampening feedbacks, the resisting feedback loops that are kind of stopping the conditions for change from emerging. So that idea of information not being shared is a really good example. So thinking about social networks, obviously there's a lot around social networks which makes things more confusing and promotes conflict and people disagreeing with each other. So that is a feedback loop that is producing resistance rather than the momentum that might come from people realizing that actually we have more in common than we're led to believe by what we find on Twitter or another social network. So that's an invitation to think about that, think about what's missing and what's working against this change. So let's take another 10 minutes on that, and then we'll come back and start to wrap up and think about next steps. And I can say a little bit more about the Tipping Points Alliance that is starting to be formed. Do let me know if you've got any questions, but otherwise I will bring back in about 10 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope that ending was a little bit more painless. Or not. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I want to take the last couple of minutes just to talk about next steps. But again, so with a little bit more time in those groups and talking about it, it'd be really good if there's any more ideas that are emerging, whether it's about that idea of what's missing, or just kind of continuing the conversations that were being had. So no pressure, but if anybody's got anything they would feel compelled to share, or again, any kind of questions or things that this has brought up that need a bit more clarification. Ben. you want to kick us off?
Yeah, it was an interesting discussion. Things like government being the biggest gatekeeper to change, at least in the UK, and being so, not even going to COP27, being an obstacle. Also, a reliance on volunteerism. That's a point that if we had a universal income, that would transform things probably in the UK. But perhaps the developing crisis amongst with the cost of living and the distance, the gap in inequality, actually forcing people or creating the circumstances so is where people might be up for sort of changes that we'd like to see. Those are the sorts of things that came up.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Lots of really interesting stuff in there. That last point, particularly around the cost of living, feels like a really good example of the existing regime starting to become unstable. The idea of we can see some changes is coming because the current system is untenable in so many ways. But what is that change going to be? What is the response to the cost of living crisis? Is it a system that reinforces the status quo and doesn't actually address the root issues, or is it something that could offer a more positive transformation? So again, noticing those early warning indicators, I think, is a really important part of this process. Jack, you've been very kindly volunteered to share some thoughts. Thank you for that. It'd be great to hear what you were talking about.
Yeah, no problem. Mine's coming very much from my work. I'm trying to put together a community climate adaptation toolkit, and the sort of barriers or things that I'm coming up against are that we want to spread this across Somerset, but it's pretty much just me working on this full-time and a couple of colleagues working on it part-time. And how do you support up to 600 plus communities potentially to do this kind of work? Are there more organizations perhaps that we need to try and get involved, or more groups, or how can we pass these resources over to start moving towards change, but make sure they don't fall through the cracks for lack of support? I talked a bit about agency as well. I think a lot of people don't realize how much agency they already have or could have. I think a lot of people feel that it's someone else's responsibility or within someone else's ability to make change. But everyone can kind of start somewhere, and questions can be asked, and you can work out what's going forward. So it's a real mindset thing to do. And I'm sure it's been talked about in other places as well, but the weight of responsibility of doing things in environmental groups that I've experienced, often there's a few very passionate people that end up taking on perhaps too many things because they're so keen to do good work and see change happen, but then they become overwhelmed and burnt out. How do we avoid that? Is there something about the kind of community organizing approach maybe where there's not so much of a top-down leadership approach and different people take responsibility, and it's really encouraged that everyone gets involved on what they want to do, and it becomes a broader church? Those are some of the things I talked about. Inga, I don't know if Inga wants to talk about it, but she had a very interesting point about different sort of mindsets and cultural factors that can affect how change happens as well, which I thought was very interesting thing. But yeah.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Inga, indirectly for that thought. Brilliant, really interesting ideas. That idea of agency to me comes back to, I think, what was mentioned earlier around behavior change. Of an example of, it might be in some instances we don't actually have to change anything. It's about helping people realize the agency that they have, but that it's already there. Those conditions are there. We just need to make them more visible or create structures that enable them to function, which is not a simple thing to do. But also, I think your work on adaptation is a really good example, thinking about triggers. So in some of the other sessions, we talked about triggers as potential triggers being not just the things that I talk through, but also you could have a trigger as an extreme event, like a flood or a pandemic or something like that. It could be a trigger in which people realize, okay, the system has changed, the world I live in is different, and it makes people more open to other types of change. However, that's not guaranteed. And I'm sure we've all got examples of things in our own communities or our countries where we thought, well, surely that's going to change something. I mean, in the UK, we see, there's flooding all of the time. In other countries, wildfires. But thinking back to the tipping points model of if the conditions aren't right for that change to actually trigger a new system, we just roll back into the original one because that resistance is still there. So we can have an extreme event. We can have something that seems absolutely, there's no way we can return to normal after this has happened, but yet we still do return to normal. And I think noticing, well, what makes something a trigger for change or not a trigger for change, that's where I think the framework can be really useful in thinking, well, what were the conditions that were in place and how had they been reinforced or dampened down by particular feedback loops? And I think a lot of the things that we talked about here around, well, if there's flooding, but nobody wants to talk about it, then it's not going to trigger a change. But if there's a mechanism in place where people can express their fear, their grief around it, their confusion around, well, is this related to climate change or is this not? Then those can be the conditions where actually, okay, well, it's going to happen again. We need new policies. We need more community resilience, and it can be a trigger for change. So, Jack, it'd be really interesting to hear more about how your project develops and how this can relate to it. Any other final comments or questions or thoughts before we finish up? There's loads in the chat, so thank you everyone who's been sharing there. And again, I'll capture those things and make sure that they're copied round. Debs, I saw you briefly unmute. Did you want to jump in there, or Phil? Did you have your hand up there? Sorry, I just looked away for a second. Jane, you've got your hand up. Third time lucky.
I think. Yeah, I mean, you spoke there about that kind of that reaction to grief, and obviously we've got COP27 coming up, and there's that, I know from COP26 it was that massive kind of reaction and that kind of public grief after COP26. And have you I'm just kind of almost thinking about that idea of it being the grief and possibly that expression of grief, being allowed to present that grief as not the tipping point itself, but as part of that change, as a significant moment. It's not the event, it's the reaction to it in terms of your grief. Is there much around that you're aware of? Because that's just got me thinking on a line of something that someone else is doing here. And it would be fascinating to know if that's something we could and should be tapping into more.
Yeah, I totally agree. From an academic perspective, I think there's really a lot of work around grief and that emotional side. I don't think those links have been made a lot currently, bringing it into the tipping points framework, because it comes from this quite ecological, data-driven perspective. So that's one of the things we need to change. But yes, there is a lot of stuff out there. I know, Hilary, I don't know if you could share in the chat a link, if you can find it, to the Walking Forest as a good example of that's a project that deals specifically with this idea of expressing collective grief. So there are some really good case studies of things out there that do that. And we need to learn from that, bring in the emotional side, because that's a huge part of what makes something a trigger or not, whether those kind of emotional processes and that emotional space is there for people to express grief, because if they do, then they can then think about change, what happens next. But if we can't express grief, we get stuck in our patterns and our systems, and it's very hard to feel agency. Thank you, Hilary. Phil Shepherd.
Thanks. Just 2 points about structure. One, I think that we need to think about scale a bit, because nature doesn't do scale in the way that we do. We think in the post-industrial world, everything's got to be kind of scaled up, and we look at it, even though we're not intending to, there's that tendency to think in those kinds of terms, when in fact, any close examination of nature shows us that every single interaction is a unique one and completely governed by the circumstances in which that interaction is taking place, and in not just governed by, but also feeding back into that. So there's something about scale, something about the model needing to allow for that. The other thing that occurs to me about it is that I'm not quite sure what happens to the learning. So you get the trigger point and it happens, and what happens might not be what you'd intended, or it might be what you intended, but then it gets repurposed, or it happens alongside some other things that you certainly didn't intend. So what happens to that learning? Where's the feedback? Just the kind of old action learning model, I suppose. Those two thoughts about structure.
Thanks, Phil. That's really, really useful. Yeah, and things I don't have easy answers to, but definitely things to take away and build into how this develops. I think points of scale and how do we actually learn from this, and that relates to, I think, one of the comments in the chat from earlier around, can we just notice these things retrospectively or not? Beth, did you have your hand up a minute ago?
No, I just might have been generally waving my hands about. I don't think so.
Great.
I was just sort of thinking as I was writing, because you were speaking about, I sort of latched onto grief, and I know that there's a lot of conversation about people's experiences around grief, and there's a lot of that going around. I mean, not just with the pandemic and with climate, but also specifically, but also just about ways of life changing, especially amongst sovereign Indigenous communities in places like Canada. And so what came to my mind immediately is this movement in the North, and a woman up there wrote a book called The Right to be Cold. The entire culture of the Arctic, from language to food to story to teaching stories to meaning, is land, maybe land and ice based, and interacting with all the other beings of place. And so what happens when all of that disappears and starts to disappear? The Arctic is hit very hard and very fast, climate change. And so I'm thinking about that how that push comes into the political arena in Canada, at least, and I don't doubt in places like Finland with the Sami people as well. So I think that's a really interesting place to look at, where Indigenous communities, again, are pushing back out of this. And believe me, they have had more than their share of grief due to industrial modernity. Thank you very much. Right. So yeah, it's just what came to mind for me. So I posted just a link, I think,
Thank you,
to the review of the book in the Globe and Mail.
Brilliant. Thanks, Beth. I'm very glad I misinterpreted your hand waving. Really glad you added that in.
All right. So thank you for letting me share that in any case. So.
Yeah. And again, I think there's a couple of things that come out of there for me. One is the vital importance that this research, these frameworks, these resources are not just coming from a particular perspective, a kind of a Western ideology, that we make these as, kind of open and diverse as possible. And the other thing around, I think, grief helps us also understand the arbitrary nature of this positive negative binary of when we talk about grief, it kind of breaks down that binary into a much more nuanced argument. And so really definitely taking away that importance of who is deciding what is positive and negative as a tipping point, and what comes from that.
But it's also the thing that grief stirs the heart, and so we come to what matters to us, and so we come to we're called to stand forth. And I suppose that is an upside of that, is it's not a comfortable place to be. There's no question, but it's not a bad place to be.
Thank you, Ben. Right, we're a few minutes over, so I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you so much for all of your thought and input into this. So this, as I said, this is part of a wider series that will finish at the end of November, after which I'll kind of try and take everything that's come out of that and put that into a report that's sort of easily accessible and readable and shareable. more immediately than that, I'll share a recording, I'll share the presentation and a couple of resources that you can start using immediately, but really keen for this to be an ongoing conversation and a really collaborative process. So there's this thing called the Global Tipping Points Alliance, which came out of the conference. It's still quite unclear what exactly that means. And there's a risk that it becomes quite a sort of high level academic space. So I think it's really important that we demonstrate the need for that to be a much more collaborative and emergent space where anyone can be a part of that and both learn from what's coming out of it, but also contribute to that. So I'll share more information about that when we have it, but that will start taking shape over the coming months and towards next year as things develop. So if you've signed up to this, I'll have your email address and I'll keep you updated on everything we've got. But please do get in touch with thoughts, ideas, ways you think this could be improved, other groups or communities who should be inputting into this. And I'm really open to ideas on that. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Debs, for sharing your perspective, and thanks for everyone contributing to the breakout rooms. I'll save the chat, loads to go through there, and I'll take out the bits to send in the follow-up email. But thanks for being with us, and hopefully see you again.